I know, it's really late, isn't it? Welcome in everyone, welcome to September's reading wrap up. I didn't mean for this to be uploaded so late, and I'm actually filming it really late, and basically I have no excuses. I'm not gonna give you a bunch of excuses. Welcome to the September reading wrap up anyway. I've been like really flogging myself with my content schedule lately, and I know it doesn't seem like it because all my videos are late and I'm skipping uploads and it all feels very sporadic, but working really hard on like multiple things, and my camera's broken, so it's making filming really difficult. I'm sending it off next week, but I have another one, so it shouldn't impact the videos too much apart from how it looks because it will be a different camera. Anyway, I'm rambling. Welcome to September's reading wrap up for the third time. My name's Charlotte. If you're new here, welcome in. I do book reviews every month. I have been for the past few years, and I do have a playlist with all my 2025 book reviews. I do also have a BookTok account as well as like a regular TikTok account, but as always, the information is in the description box below. I don't have a Goodreads, I'm really sorry. I do have a story graph though, although I don't type out my reviews, I just kind of star them and move them into various shelves, etc. I always start the video with telling you how many books I read in the month, and I'm gonna have to go back through and check because it's been a while. My October reading wrap up will be out literally very swiftly after this, so I was gonna save it because I'd left it so long. I was like, maybe I'll just combine September and October, but that doesn't really feel fair. But then I did think this is a bit of feedback you can give me, and I feel like I know what your answer is going to be. Would you prefer my reading wrap-ups for 2026 to be 2 months combined and longer videos? So like at the end of February, I would post January and February reading wrap-up, or do you just prefer for me to keep doing them monthly? I don't have a preference. I just wondered what you wanted because I know you like longer videos oftentimes. All of that aside, I read 6 books in September. 4 of them were digital on my Kindle and 2 of them were physical books, which I've got right here. I've really found my pace with reading this year, having had no like reading target or anything, and I feel like 5 to 7 books is really just like my sweet spot. Works really well for me, and unless I am reading like very short books, it's quite rare that I go over that, or if I'm like just having a really good reading month. But I don't know, I think I've been quite busy lately, and towards the end of the year I'm definitely petering out on how much I'm reading. I feel the end of the year looming, and there's a few books that I want to read before the end of the year, and they're all quite long. A lot of my TBR shelf of stuff that is coming up is very dense, lengthy books, so we'll see. I did do a 10 books that I want to read before the end of the year video about this time last year. I don't think I read any of the books that were on there. If I'm completely honest. But if that is something you would like from me, what's the month? October, November, December. If you would like me to do a books I want to read before the end of the year, I will. I'll do it. I would love to do it actually. It might not be 10, but anyway, this has been the world's longest intro. I'm so sorry. So the format of today's video is slightly different because I read and completed a series this month in the month of September. I did read all the books separately. So I read 2, then sandwiched another book in the middle, then read another 2. But for the purpose of today's video, because of the nature of the book, I'm going to review the series as a whole. It doesn't really make sense for me to review them all individually because I read them all basically back to back. It doesn't make sense for a couple of reasons. These reviews are always spoiler free. If I do tell you some spoilers, it's like nothing you can't find out from reading the back of the books, that kind of thing. But these reviews are always spoiler free, and it is really hard to review series in a spoiler free nature because the sequence of events just automatically, you know what I'm trying to say. I wrote these reviews quite a long time after reading them as well, and it made more sense for me to type them up as a whole entity. So I will discuss the first book to give you an idea of what the series is like, of what it's about, of what the character is about, but I won't be sitting down and being like, this is what I thought of book 1, 2, 3, 4. I hope that's okay. I think it makes sense for me to do it this way because I don't usually read series like this. I don't often do this. So if it was across multiple months, I would spread it out, but I might as well do them all together. So without further ado, here is the first series of books I read this month. I read all of these on my Kindle, so they were digital books. I read the Cursed Legacies series, books 1 to 4. I'll list off the titles in a second, but these are written by Morgan B. Lee. In this series, and in order from 1st to 4th, Blood Oath, Shadow Heart, Twisted Soul, and Divine Fate. And these books are fantasy romance. I'm going to start with a little synopsis, as I always do, to just let you know what the book is about. Everbound University is a magical graduate school for any person's supernatural, spooky, non-human, not of this world. You can't not attend unless you wanted to be hunted down for illegally inhabiting the mortal realm. Most of the attendees at Everbound are referred to as legacies and are all descendants of the prestigious 4 houses. And as descendants of these houses, all of the legacies have like a a curse, essentially. They're all cursed, and the only way to break these curses is to become part of something called a quintet. In your quintet, you bind your heart to the 4 other quintet members, and a quintet in this world is considered a God's given blessing. It's a really high privilege to be matched with a quintet. So for our female main character, Maven, this is actually not such a good thing. She doesn't want to be bound to anyone. It generally doesn't end well for her when she is bound to others. So naturally, the universe messes with her and binds her into a quintet with 4 of the most powerful legacies in Everbound University, one of which who is actually a professor, and she decides to reject her matches for their own good. But notoriously high-profile, privileged, spoiled legacy men don't take rejection well. They won't leave her alone. They have the kind of notoriety that begins to draw attention to Maven, which is actually the last thing she wants in this situation, given that she's hiding a massive secret about her attendance at Everbound University. She decides she'll do whatever she can to make them decide that she's not worth it. Okay, so like, look, this was a palette cleanser for me. I accidentally cleansed my palette for 4 books. I keep relapsing on questionable of quality fantasy romance, and I hate myself for it. If you've been here a while, I think there is a cycle of this. I think it's me. I am the drama. Anyway, I hate to reduce a book to merely its tropes, because I think a big problem with the publishing industry at the moment is this kind of like over tropification of things. It's giving fast fashion. But what I'm going to do is tell you the tropes so you can understand better as to why I picked it. Because firstly, you know I can't resist a magical academy book, and this is set in a magical academy / university. And secondly, you know I can't resist, against my better judgment, reverse harem / why choose. You know that this together is my kryptonite. I know it's not good for me, but I keep going back. So I say all that to say, take this review with a pinch of salt, because personally, I don't watch reality TV. I don't watch like any kind of like trashy TV. So this is like my equivalent. That's how I want you to frame it in your mind. This is my equivalent. And I'm not judging anyone who like reads deeply in the romantic genre, not at all. Everyone has different tastes, but this is what these books do for me. Do I remember it? Barely. Did I have a good time reading it? You could say I had a good time reading it in the same way that you have a good time drinking a whole bottle of wine until the next day. I'm gonna start with the characters. Firstly, I'm a sucker for a reverse harem, why choose love story type thing, because quite frankly, what's better than one love interest? 4. I do usually love the way in reverse harem books they give each of the male main character love interests very like distinct personalities. There's this element of one guy's always the really grumpy guy, one guy's like the golden retriever, one guy's like the kind of hard to break, and then one guy's always like the insane guy. And that was what was in this. And each of the male love interests in this series of books was very distinct. So it's quite easy, especially when you're juggling multiple characters, pardon the pun, but it's quite easy to distinguish them. They all had their own very separate voices. And then you do have an extra layer of this, because in this universe there are multiple types of supernatural beings, which can be a bit hit or miss sometimes, but we've got like fae, blood fae, shifters, vampires, we've got alchemists, we've got people all kind of in between all of those things. We've got elementals. So there's multiple different species and supernatural beings. And each of the men in this book embody one of those as well. So they're all quite different. And in this, their personalities line up with their abilities. I think generally I don't find it fun in these kinds of books when they're all immediately obsessed with the female main character, because it's just kind of boring. Like, where's the fight? Where's the chase? I think the reason I like the separate personalities and all of kind of the different elements is because quite often in these books I tend to reject the notion that it's going to take like one person to make you whole and complete. I think it just challenges that idea a little bit more, and there's always such a sense of like completeness, and they all provide something different to me, but all we have equally amazing relationships, blah blah blah. You know what I'm trying to say? I think in a lot of romance books it's kind of like, I didn't know who I was until I found this absolutely one person. But when you have like reverse harem and there is like more of a romantic angle, you get like a lesson from each person. I do think their traits and personalities felt a touch overdone by the end of the series, but also I did binge it, so that might just be I spent too much time with them. But you know, we have this classic fantasy man kind of situation, the big fucking brawny, hot-headed, possessive shifter that like can't even bear anyone being in the same room as her because he's like so hot for her. He like can't stand another man being in the vicinity. He like claims her. We've got the super icy elemental that like literally doesn't even want to speak to her for quite a long time. And then we've also got, there's always like the nut job, isn't there? He's called like the Nightmare Prince, and for some reason I think they've given him an English accent, but he's like the sick one. He's like super freaked out. Felt very intensely done by the time I'd got to the end of book 4. But then I've got to remember that kind of thing is socially acceptable in this universe, to be like super freaked out or to like want to claim your partner. Me absolutely horrified in real life at the idea of any partner wanting to claim anyone, but me when he claims her in the book. Like, I think the most interesting character arc for me was probably Everett, because he's such a different person by the end of book 4 than he is at book 1. He's like the icy cold elemental, and I think that was done quite well. Felt like we had a bit more feeling to him. But overall, actually, nearly everyone in this book has a terrible backstory that I think just means you root for them for most of the book anyway. On to our female protagonist, Maven. Maven. If you like the really, I'm laughing because I can't even like say it. If you really like this kick-ass female main character that is like really angry, not like other girls, cold, murderous, doesn't like to wear dresses ever, doesn't like love, doesn't like cuddling, doesn't like looking people in the eye, loves like murderous shit and like gothic stuff, you'll really like this. This will be right up your street. She was fairly cliche at the beginning, and I do think she didn't particularly feel like a girl's girl at the start, but I do think that is quite well explained by her traumatic backstory. For the most part, I just skimmed past her bits where she was just being like super corny. She has this like Wednesday Addams, very, very gloomy, like melancholy, gothic vibe to her, but she's like also constantly furious. She's got like hidden knives everywhere, you know. She like doesn't want to wear a dress because she's like, where am I supposed to put the knife? She's one of those main characters that acts like having feelings is like deeply embarrassing, which doesn't resonate with me really. But because of how cynical her character is, I don't know, quite a lot of the time I wasn't really that convinced that she truly believed that she was that cynical. There is this element that will make sense a little bit later in the book, and it is that Maven as a character is like deeply inexperienced in life. It's set in like a vaguely modern day, but it's not too specific. But yeah, there's aspects of technology that she can't come to terms with. There's aspects of like food. She's just basically like the most inexperienced person you've ever met. But I do feel there was quite a lot of contingency errors with that, because it's kind of just like sprinkled in throughout the story. Obviously she's like quick to grasp a lot of stuff. I don't feel like it really matches up. I don't really feel like it matches up, and I feel like that maybe was kind of like an unnecessary part of the story. I think it could have been written another way maybe, but maybe I'm being picky. In contrast, they always provide this like bubbly girl character, and in this instance this was her roommate. I think her roommate was called Kenzie. Yeah, really liked Kenzie for the most part. Kind of wish we got a bit more of her, but one thing that really irked me about Kenzie was like the language. This is a very me specific thing. It really takes me out of books. Kenzie is supposed to be like the antithesis to Maven. Bright, bubbly, forward, slutty. Her words, not mine. I'm not calling Kenzie a slut, but like very sexually experienced. It makes sense in the context of the world. People are just more sexually open. Anyway, but she does a lot of talk about social media. She uses the word riz. She like does a lot of slang, and it gives me the ick a bit at some points. It took me out of the reading experience a bit, because I feel like they could have portrayed Kenzie as this very kind of like progressive forward person without this like modern slang, but I feel like it probably was there to provide a contrast. I don't know, I just don't like social media stuff in my books. Anyway, I've been talking about this for like 18 minutes now, so let's move on to the world building and the plot. It's quite slow to begin with, if I'm completely honest. There was a lot of this tell, don't show, like info dumping at the start. I don't really like to refer to it as info dumping when it comes to fantasy. I just think it was maybe a bit clumsily written. But that being said, it did hook me in, and obviously the explanation was necessary for me because I had no clue what was going on. As far as the world and like the legacies and stuff, it was fairly easy to grasp. I think ultimately for me, the premise was like really good, and I think we could have got something a little better. I did feel very dropped in with Maven's character, because you know there's this sense when you're reading that you as the reader should kind of like know what's going on a bit with the main character, right? We were as blindsided as the characters, oftentimes the other characters in the book as to why Maven made decisions, the secrets Maven was keeping, but not in a fun, twisty way, in a way that just felt like we were being withheld a lot. I think it's meant to kind of double down on how secretive she is as a person, but a lot of the times I would be reading a passage and like quite a big thing would be dropped and I'd be like, have I missed something? And I'd like flick back through and I'd be like, no, we just didn't know. And it is just Maven withholding the information until the 11th hour because she has such a hard time trusting people. It did get a bit tiring after the third or fourth like revelation or like big event. The magic in the world building and like the sense of place is very interesting. I always find I really get a good sense of place when it's in a magical academy or a university. There's something that is so comforting to me about academic settings, and I really actually liked in this book the fact that there was like multiple varieties and species and like people intermingling and living together. I think sometimes it's a little bit more interesting than like a single soul, like, you know, like a vampire book or a fae book. But then some books will do it quite poorly and it will feel very overwhelming and it won't feel like an intentional decision, it will feel like an afterthought. But in this one it was done quite well, and I love the concept of a quintet. I thought it was really, really neat. Basically everyone in this is descended from 4 houses, like all the legacies anyway. I'm pretty sure the 4 houses are fae, shifters, vampires and elementals, but I could be wrong. Basically you want to be bound into a quintet because those 4 houses individually were too powerful for any one of them to rule over like the dominion and the universe. So they bound them to each other, the universe or the gods or whatever, bound the original 4 together so that they like have to make decisions as a unit and they basically like have to get on. So basically they just got like nerfed into this group, and quintets are often romantic and sexual, but often platonic as well, so you don't have to be like with everyone. But it means descendants of the quintet also have like 2 sets of parents a lot of the time, which I thought was nice. And there was kind of like a queer norm element about the quintets, so it wasn't always like a heteronormative style, like a hetero couple. It was sometimes like 4 men or 4 women, or, you know, every single combination you could possibly think of. 5, not 4, you know what I'm trying to say. And one of them would be the quintet leader, and they're all like bound to that person essentially. And you can have like kids in your quintet in all the different combinations. You can be platonic, but you're still like soulmates. You basically end up being a family, but all of you are like fated mate to the leader. I just thought it was an interesting concept, and obviously as a result I will say that this book is very open door, very sexually explicit, and I'd be lying if I said that's not what kept me hooked for the vast majority of the books. I can't remember which book it is, but this often happens in fantasy romance, usually around the 2nd or 3rd book. I want to say it must have been the 3rd, but there was one point when the book started feeling like more sex than plot, which is not what I like from fantasy romance. But that does like kind of switch over to more action than sex and more plot than sex back again quite swiftly. And from what I do remember of book 1 and 2, they were written very well in terms of the tension, in terms of like the relationship building and consent and all of that kind of stuff. Book 3 and 4 do become a bit more action based, I think. I can't remember because I read them all, they all merge into one. They're not very long overall, I don't think either. It didn't take me very long to read the whole series, but yeah, I think that's my whole review. This has probably been a really long review, but I'm trying to remember that I was reviewing essentially 4 books and a series, but this just made sense to me, so hopefully you enjoyed this. Ultimately, the writing and the story did leave a little bit to be desired. I wouldn't say it was like a great read, but this for me is kind of an escapism read, a little bit of a head empty vibe, if you will, and for that reason and that sole purpose, it was a bit of fun. There was a lot that I didn't enjoy about it when I was reading it, but I can barely remember that. So yeah, you'll have to take me at face value. I don't often read a lot of books like this anymore, so when I do, very much just okay for me. On to the next book, which is a physical one. I read Negative Space by B.R. Yeager, and this is a horror book, and boy was it horrific. This book follows 4 teenagers who live in a very small, poor, working mill town. I think it's in New Hampshire. In this small, poor working mill town, there has been for like decades now an epidemic of suicides, unexplained. And to cope with this, the 4 teenagers abused like a bizarre, somewhat legal or decriminalized hallucinogenic substance called wall. I can't say it. Wall. How do you pronounce that? Well, I'm gonna say well. I don't know how else to synopsize this book, to be honest. This took me a long time to read. It's not that it's that dense because it is only 363 pages. It's just that it was a difficult read. Also, just a quick trigger warning that we'll be briefly talking about the topic of suicides, not in any great detail or depth, but obviously that is quite a large element of the book. This is one of the most depressing, bleak, nihilistic, grim reads that I've read ever, I think. Bone chilling, like truly bone chilling. And I don't even think it's to do with the suicides or like with the events in the book. It's literally just to do with like the outlook of life. Yeah, it's not done solely to the events. I just think the author has such a fantastic way of setting up the atmosphere. The author has just done, like, quite frankly, a fantastic job of cultivating this incredibly terrible vibe, terrible atmosphere. As someone that grew up in a town, bear in mind it wasn't nearly as bad as this, let's be real, but as someone that grew up in a town, a very small town as a teenager, a very depressed teenager, a very lonely teenager, with a lot of very intense friendships, the bleakness of how it feels to be a teenager is so well captured. It made me feel quite queasy. And also I think to look at it through the lens of like, yeah, my teenage life probably like wasn't that bad actually. Yeah, some like fucked up shit happened, but being in that headspace and being that teenager, obviously every teenager just thinks it's the worst thing to ever happen to them. You feel things so strongly. You go through like a chemical shift in your mind when you're growing up into adolescence that everything feels a lot bleaker than it is. And that is what's captured so well. Obviously what the difference is that the reality of their living situation and the epidemic of the suicide, it means that not only what they are feeling is bleak, but what they're experiencing is bleak too, if that makes sense. I'm over explaining now. But that kind of inherent selfishness that a lot of teenagers have, this it's only me, why me, the secrecy of what's going on, it's just done in such a, gives me the heebie-jeebies. It made me feel a bit sick reading it. It's a very unique type of, I guess ennui is the word. It's a very unique type of ennui. And I think honestly, like that's partially the real horror of this book. This is written in a way that it follows like 3 or 4 character narratives that all kind of weave together by the end, and it centers around one of their peers who's kind of like the figurehead of the group, called Tyler, like a very troubled boy. They orbit around Tyler like he's the sun. I say the sun, but I think actually a black hole would be more apt, or it's like circling the drain. Tyler's the drain, you know? A maelstrom perhaps, actually. Great imagery. Let's hold on to the spiraling and the circling of the drain and revisit it in a minute, because we're talking about horror and you know I love talking about this with horror. Considering they are all like bland, self-important, self-obsessed teenagers, each character is written incredibly well. They are so real. They could literally just like jump off the page. These could all be real people. They're written so convincingly. Their lives are so repetitive. Nothing really that important happens like day to day for them. And I know it sounds a bit silly. If you read the book, you probably think the opposite, but like in the grand scheme of things, they just like go to school, they leave school, they do drugs, they see each other. But I think that's why it's so poignant. So let's revisit the thing I was talking about, spirals and circles. If you've watched my videos before, I often talk about this in relation to like narratives and plots. I think it mostly applies to horror, especially around horror, to be honest. But some of the best horror books and some of the best horror books that I enjoy and like my style of enjoyment, the horror and the tension and the dread is it's like spiralic in nature. Some of the best horrors, like in any kind of media, and some of the best fear is a cycle. And it's a bit visual, so like bear with me. I've explained this before. It's like a spiral or a funnel, right? As we travel down the spiral, we pass the same point again and we revisit elements that seem familiar but are slightly different, and it creates this like tension and this kind of friction of like, have I been here before? We revisit elements that we've seen before, but perhaps they're like twisted into something new or broken out of shape or twisted into something familiar. And I think that's what creates this like displacement and this unsettlement that can be very fearful. If you're taking it very literally, the unsettling nature of repetition and passing the same point over and over again is like sort of a horror and a hell within itself, no? I mean this in a very loose, abstract way as well with the spiral. So try not to take it super literally. It's just I'm a visual person, so for me it's like a better way to explain it. I think of it in the same way about time, that time is a spiral, and I don't mean like a funnel tornado spiral this time. I mean like a flat 2D one that you would draw. And I always like to think it's a nice like idealized way of thinking, but that's why you experience a lot of nostalgia, or that's why like life is cyclical and the same things seem to happen in different ways, because you like pass back the same point, you know? I think it's a bit airy-fairy, but let's talk about it in the literature sense. Some horror books will utilize this like spiralic funneling sense of dread incredibly well. It's this feeling of like, oh, I've been here before, right? It can be overdone because it was where this book lost me. It lost me somewhere in the middle. The writing was already very dark and it was very bleak and it was very gloomy and a hard slog to get through, and we've got all this incredible dark occult imagery constantly, and we get this constant repetition of imagery throughout the book. And it's interesting because is it repetition or is it ritual? And ritual is a huge part of the book as well. So there's this ritualistic repetition element going on and this sense of like the mundane and the teenagers like slogging through the same thing over and over again. And for me, the repetition meant that the impact just was lost. The sense of impact from all of that just lost its meaning. And actually that's quite clever because I think that represents the town and the lives on a larger scale, that the repetition becomes drudgery. But as a reader, I do think it was lost on me. I'm having a hard time to put my feelings into words about this book. I say that like I just haven't sat and spoken for 12 minutes, but I'm struggling to put my words into something substantial because the book to me felt so abstract and so kind of like experimental with its horror. And it sounds silly and counterintuitive to say experimental because this is a book about teenagers in a small town, lots of drugs, there's loads of occultism going on, there's suicides, and all of that stuff is very tangible, real things that we've probably got some grasp on or some experience with, maybe not necessarily the occultism or the suicides, but you get what I'm trying to say. I've got too many words in me today. I think it was the experimentation of the horror that combined with like the repetition of the imagery that it kind of just didn't really hit as a horror for me. This is kind of like the perfect review for me because I do really love it when a book really like challenges what I think about it, because one thing I will say is this book was very impactful and I did not like it. I did not like reading this book. I do not like this book. I didn't enjoy it really, but I do respect it. I deeply respect it for what it's doing, and it's not often I say that. And it's not even that I didn't like it because of the subject matter, I just didn't find it like a fun reading experience. But then that also in itself is like really challenging and I think like a cool concept. I think this could be brilliant and I think it can be for so many people. I just don't think it was my cup of tea. It was a hard read because as I was reading it, I felt like I was being sucked into a black hole and I was like having to claw myself out. I was circling that drain. The light was about to get snuffed out. It did not resonate with me in any kind of good way. I know it's not supposed to, that's not its purpose, but yeah. Very interesting though. Go get a thesaurus and look up the entry for bleak and then like every word under it listed. That's how I feel about this book. Do you know what? I think this was a hard review month because I think this is why I've put off filming this and typing these all out for so long, because the barrier wasn't even the filming, it's the fact that I hadn't written down my thoughts. Because to review a series is out my norm, and then to review such an insane and as an intense book as this one felt really difficult. And then the final book I read for September is also one that has been much anticipated and also again feels like quite a difficult review, and I'll tell you for why. I read Katabasis by R.F. Kuang and it is a fantasy book. I'm not really a new release girl, but I bought this and I bought Burial Bones. Our protagonist Alice Law is a doctoral student studying analytical magic at Cambridge University. She is increasingly obsessed with becoming one of the most brilliant minds to study in this field, and she has sacrificed everything up to this point to achieve that. Jacob Grimes is her advisor and dies in a magical incident that is her fault. He is now in hell and she's not going to let his death stop her achieving her dreams. So with the help of another student who is also her rival, Peter Murdoch, they journey together into hell to retrieve his soul at the cost of their own, actually. Oh, the anticipated Katabasis. I'm nervous about reviewing this because I've seen that there has been a lot of discourse online about it, but I don't really think that's the space I'm in on the internet. I am a fan of her work. Some of it I've liked, some of it I've not liked. You know, I like her stuff. But I know she has some really rabid and feral fans, but I also know there are a lot of people who are just like haters for haters' sake. Here I am contributing to the endless echo chamber of reviews, and I think that's why I always feel a bit weird when I buy new releases, because I don't feel like my reviews really add much or stand out. There's a lot of very, very talented people out there who can put much better into words what I'm trying to say. I'm a very casual reviewer, I think. Anyway, I was really looking forward to reading this because I read Babel last year, I think, and it is is one of my favourite books. I really enjoyed it. I have read The Poppy War, I think, books 1 and 2, and then I never finished it. And I read Yellowface, which was a bit of a mixed review. I think I must have all of these reviews somewhere on my channel. I read The Poppy War, I want to say in 2023, and I must have read Yellowface last year, so it will be in some of my reviews somewhere. Did I read book 2 of The Poppy War? I must have. I don't really remember it. Sorry, this isn't about other R.F. Kuang books, but I just thought it was interesting to talk about. Katabasis, I'm calling it Katabasis. We've all seen the video. She doesn't mind how anyone pronounces it. She hasn't released what like the official pronunciation is. Beautiful cover, hardcover, difficult for me. Don't love them. Didn't get the one with sprayed edges. 2 of my very favourite YouTubers have released very long videos with their thoughts on this, and I've been holding off on reading or watching any reviews until I film this video because I'm quite easily influenced by other people's thoughts on books. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to start off with what didn't work for me, because I think that is the more significant portion of the video. I hope that's not too negative, but I like to round off with good thoughts. I thought this book was very much just like okay, even like slightly below okay. And in my head, I don't do star ratings anymore, but like a 3-star to me is like an okay but somewhat enjoyable book. A 2.5 is just kind of like a very mid book. For me, this sits somewhere between a 2.5 and a 3-star. I don't rate my books, but I thought that was relevant in this context to show you that what I thought of it. It was a little disappointing at points. It was a little boring at points. I am not really one to hold things to too high of a standard, which is why I don't usually read new releases. But I will say that the premise of this was really brilliant sounding, and it sounded very exciting, and it's what captured my interest. I love the notion of like traversing the various different levels and layers of hell. I love the academic setting. It was kind of implied that there was a little bit of a romantic subplot, which I was really excited for because I just love a romantic subplot. Unfortunately, the premise just wasn't executed in a way that felt satisfying for me. And I think this is the experience for a lot of other people from what I've seen in like ad hoc reviews. It often felt tedious and long-winded, and it was good, I guess, but it just wasn't great. It was just like very mid. And I know it just feels inflammatory to call like an R.F. Kuang book mid, to use that specific word, but you know what I'm trying to say. For someone that reads so much, I need to find more vocabulary around saying something that was just okay. I think up until about Court 2 or Court 3, it was very exciting. It felt so creative, and it just completely like whet my appetite for the rest of the book. So it's the courts in hell. I'll try find the illustration quick. It's like based on the 7 deadly sins, so they're all done as kind of courts: pride, desire, tyranny, cruelty, etc. I love the inclusion of the different maps at the back as well, by the way. I think that is a really nice visual element, and the illustrations are beautiful. They're just done really simply and really well. But following those 2 to 3 courts, anyway, it lacked a lot. It wasn't just the courts that felt like an exciting and a promising start. It was Alice and this relationship that she had with her professor, and it was this kind of like tenuous, oh, what's going on between them? Why is he so evil? Why is she trapped into this? Why is she saving him? How has she killed him? It felt very action-packed, and it felt very captivating. I also really love the element of magic being utilised as like the norm and as part of everyday life, and I think that's what I liked so much about Babel as well, is that we have this setup of magic being used to assist in everyday things like boil kettles, but also run railroads. It's also what I loved about Blood over Brighthaven too, but obviously there's always a cost. I love the idea of conduits and alchemy and things being channeled and energy transmuting and like stuff being siphoned. As the courts progressed, I just don't feel like we had any sense of place whatsoever. Obviously it's hell. Obviously amazing imagery of like the deserts and stuff, but I think the descriptive elements of the place really just started to like get lost, but it didn't feel like a stylistic decision. The academia and the referencing and the logical explanations stopped informing the context, but started to feel really like tedious and meandering, and like they were just shoehorned in, and it was kind of like losing us. We were all over the place. We would go on these like long rambling explanations of logic that felt like they were going somewhere and felt like they would kind of wrap up neatly. But then by the time you get to the end of that, you're like, where was I in the story? Like, what was going on? It was taking me out of it. I don't want to spend the whole review comparing it to Babel because they are 2 separate books, and I don't like to do that. But I think what's important to note is that Babel had a lot of academic, linguistic reference, and it is for me what I'd consider quite academically dense. But that really worked in Babel because I felt like it added to the context of the story and added to the context of the book and felt kind of like a helpful aside. Even though it was such a main portion of the book, it's not really fair to call it an aside, but it was often adding to the story in a way that was really interesting and like didn't feel like a chore to read. It didn't feel like reading like a textbook. And I know that's what lot of people have said about Katabasis. I don't think it felt like reading a textbook, but I'm just using that as like an example of what people have been saying. I don't think that the academic referencing and all of the kind of dense, logical textbook physicsy stuff really added to anything in this. So what I was saying is that a lot of the criticism that I have seen has mentioned the fact that it felt like reading a textbook, addressed the fact that they felt like R.F. Kuang was flaunting her academia, that she was like shoving it in our faces. And I understand the sentiment, but I don't actually agree, because yes, she is an incredibly intelligent, well-accomplished academic author, truly a powerhouse. But I often feel that that is part of the charm of her writing, and the passion and the excitement of that really comes through very well. You can tell she's an expert, you can tell she's a lifelong learner by the way she writes. I think that's why so many people like her books. So to say that it is her flaunting her academia and her academic background and her prowess in the field, I think is unfair, because she's always been this good. She's always been this accomplished. I don't know, it just feels a bit discordant to say that. But what I will say is the academic segue a lot in the book just didn't feel well placed. It didn't feel relevant. It felt clumsy. A lot of it probably went over my head. I've never been to uni. I'm not an academic person. I love learning. I love reading. I wouldn't consider myself an above average level of intelligence. But I do always really admire and appreciate how rich and thorough her referencing in her work is. So this isn't a critique on the volume of the referencing. It's a critique on the placement and how it was used. It took me out. I just felt like I lost my place. Was that too long of an explanation? We're still not done. I think this is going to be a really long video. So one thing I was surprised about was that she utilized shock value like quite a few times throughout the book. It was about as subtle as a brick through a window. And actually, when I think back to some of her previous books, I probably can recognize that maybe subtlety isn't something she is known for. But honestly, it just felt a bit clumsy. Something that stands out to me is, I'll try paraphrase it because I don't think I can find it. Anyway, to paraphrase, there was a sentence that was like, you know it when you saw it was like porn. I read that and it surprised me because it just like felt really out of character for the character and for the writing style as well. And there was also a similar phrase about screeching feminists or screeching activists resorting to lesbianism or something like that. And this is not me like being like the woke friend. I hate that term, by the way, but using it like ironically here. I think those words just didn't contribute anything. It felt like it was used as shock value and it felt like dead weight. And in the same vein, there is a lot of mention of like sexual harassment and eating disorders, and probably actually so much more than I can probably even list. But the mention of those subjects and the provocation of it feels cheap. And actually the thing is, she has never shied away from including challenging themes in her writing. So I think that added to my surprise when these things were brought up in a way that almost felt like a bit out of character. And I know we can't like pin an author to one style of writing for their whole life. Yeah, it felt like a cheap shot. These subjects just showed up in the way that they did, with clumsy words, with no further exploration or like picking apart or any real commentary on it. They just showed up and that was kind of like it. We're still going. I've got characters to talk about next. Our protagonist Alice, she felt a little cartoonish to me. Like a caricature of all of the unlikable female characters R.F. Kuang's ever written, really. Maybe it's just becoming a bit of a pattern. She's usually really, really skilled at writing very nuanced, living in the grey, unlikable characters, you know? Unlikable characters that you somehow root for, or characters with a complex arc. But for me, Alice is like an amalgamation of all of the other main protagonists all merged into one. She doesn't feel well-rounded. She feels annoying and sneering and pathetic and misogynistic. And actually her arc doesn't redeem her in any meaningful way. I don't know, I'm a bit bored of talking about what I didn't like about this book because I feel like I've been going on about it for ages. I think it's because most of the things I didn't like about this book are basically rooted almost entirely in the fact that it was boring or I was bored. Alice was boring to me. Alice never really felt alive as a character to me and never really incited any kind of feeling in me. There was moments where we kind of were pushed to the precipice of maybe thinking, okay, we're getting somewhere, and then we just didn't. I think there were areas of her personality that were supposed to be written and should have been really sharp and raw and like unflinching, but they just came off as whiny and annoying, unlikable and self-suffering, and they didn't land for me. Anyway, shall I move on to what I did like? I don't like to settle in the negative too long. I have to really remind myself that when I'm giving a book review that isn't 100% positive, that's a really important thing, and that it's important to analyse and pick apart media and to be critical of what you're reading and to talk about your experience, and it doesn't make you like an evil bad person. I don't think I'm an evil bad person. listen, I find it hard to be critical, and I'm getting better at it, but it feels like weighty because I know that if I ever wrote a book and someone said that about my book, I'd literally be devastated. But that's why I'll probably never write a book, because I can't handle putting out something I love into the hands of others. Anyway, not to get like really deep and introspective, but I think it's interesting how I feel so sorry for giving such like a impartial and what I think is actually probably quite fair and balanced. I'm not an inflammatory reviewer. I don't use like clickbaity stuff. I don't use very strong emotion-led language. I'm always very conscious of talking about like my feelings and this is my experience of it, because I don't want to upset anyone, let alone like other readers of the book. Yeah, I just think it's funny. I do need to get better at that. It's okay to not like a book and to talk about it, especially in a fair and measured way. Anyway, yeah, let's move on to what I did like. I liked the world building for the most part. I know I had some criticisms about the court's latter in the book, but the concept, exciting. A book that explores hell, give it to me. It felt like almost absurdist in its design and its description, and that was just like a fun experience. And actually what I did do, I highlighted every single word or reference that described a downward descent, a staircase, or just like this sense of going underground and down. I just put a little dot next to it, and I loved that imagery. I love the idea of the descent and the layers, and I knew that would be a big part of the book, but how many different ways can you say going down? Do you know what I mean? I loved it. I'm losing my voice, I need a sip of water. I think while it was working, the visual descriptions and the sense of place, it was really working and it was fun, and I liked the way that it was a bit rule defying. I loved that hell is a campus. I just found that so tongue-in-cheek and so clever and funny. The way endless academic peer review is framed as a form of torture in one of the courts was just, I thought it was brilliant. It prompts a little bit of a giggle and it feels like very on the nose. I do also always love picking out the themes that R.F. Kuang decides to like challenge and raise in her books. Challenging the idea of like misogyny and hypocrisy in academia. Love how problematic feminism can exist. Elitism and classism in academia. And just actually generally how vile just like middle-aged mediocre white men can be in academia, and how much space they can take up, and how all of that feeds into elitism and misogyny and classism. And as always, I just love the way that she weaves in all of the different like myth and legend and study and story into this depiction of hell, and how Alice researches all of that prior to going into hell to be best prepared. Love mythology, and also always really love that it's not just Western, it's a mix of all different cultures. We've got mythology and lore from Eastern literature, we've got kind of really ancient history, we've got modern depictions, we've got it from a philosophy angle. I don't know a lot about a lot of the stuff I was reading, but it made me really interested in it, so I probably should read Dante's Inferno. We have more references and research from places I can't even count, so like different cultures, religions, ideologies, and that alone made it a very rich reading experience. If only those references and that research was better structured. There's no denying really at the end of the day that her passion for what she writes is evident on every single page, regardless of how captivating we found the story. And I think that element alone, for me and for so many other people, I reckon, is what makes her work such a joy to read oftentimes. But overall, it fell flat despite all this. Passion wasn't enough this time. I could go on about this for ages, and there is so much more that I could probably say if I sat down and thought about it. But for me, it feels like at this point, when there are so many other reviews out there that probably will capture what I'm trying to say in such a more efficient and concise way, that it just feels like I am dogging on a book that I actually don't really feel that strongly about. I'm just trying to give a thorough review, and I hope a thorough review is what you got. The camera's been rolling for 32 minutes. Bloody hell, I think that was a long one. It might have been a long one. I think that was a really long one, sorry. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. It was incredibly thorough. My camera's literally about to die. I can't believe I've like nerfed my camera from talking about books for so long. But let me know what you think, especially about Katabasis. I would love to know. Oh my god, yeah, I just have so many books. I feel like I really need to do a book video soon. I might film a bookish video this weekend actually. I really need to do a bookish video because I feel like I have so much to update you on. October is going to be a very juicy reading month, although I think I've only read 2 books. I haven't even finished the second one yet. What are we going to do about that? Oh, I've started a third actually. Maybe I'll get some good reading in this weekend. Yeah, I'm gonna try to read more than 3 books this month. Anyway, it was lovely to sit here with you and talk about books again. As always, it's something I so deeply enjoy doing. And my one regret is that I just don't have as much time to read as I would like, because I would love to sit here and talk about it longer with you. I mean, I do have loads of time to read. Everyone does. I make time to read. I would love to be at the space where I'm reading like 10 books a month. But this year the goal is quality and not quantity. My upload schedule at the moment is a bit botched, as I'm sure you've all noticed, but I'm trying to get back onto things. So I upload every single Sunday and every other Wednesday. I'm pretty sure this will be coming to you on a Wednesday. So I hope your week is going okay if it did. Like I said earlier, I'll put all my links in the description box below. I've got a Storygraph page, TikTok, Instagram, the whole shebang. You know what I'm trying to do. I do have a booked highlight on my Instagram as well, so you can go look at that. If you did like today's video, it would be nice if you could leave a little thumbs up. I would love to get to 10,000 subscribers before the end of the year, and I think we can do it. Have a lovely rest of your week, and I will see you on the next video.